I was 34 when it happened. The year was 2018, and I had been camping alone for over a decade. It wasn't something I did for social media or bragging rights, I just enjoyed the quiet. No cell service, no traffic, no artificial lights. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. That fall, I decided to head up to Devil's Ridge, a remote section of the Appalachian Wilderness in Tennessee. I had camped there twice before and liked how secluded it was. No designated campsites, no marked trails, just a vast stretch of forest with rugged terrain. Most people stayed away because it was easy to get lost, and the local stories didn't help. Hunters talked about strange noises, missing dogs, things like that. I never put much stock in those kinds of tales. The only real dangers out there were the ones you could see. Bears, cougars, and the occasional lunatic. I packed light. A tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, a knife, a .357 revolver, just in case, and enough food for 4 days. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by a creek I knew, and enjoy the solitude. I parked my truck at an old logging road and hiked in about 6 miles. The air smelled like damp leaves, and the ground was soft from recent rain. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. That was one of my favorite parts of the wilderness. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. By late afternoon, I reached the creek. The water was clear and shallow, running over smooth stones. I set up camp about 30 yards from the bank, close enough for easy water access but far enough to stay dry if it rained. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate some beef jerky, and listened to the night sounds. Gulls, crickets, the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. Nothing unusual. But on the second night, things changed. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was dark. I listened. The forest had gone still. Too still. No crickets. No wind. Just silence. Then I heard it. Asterisk, asterisk, a single, deliberate step, asterisk, asterisk. Not an animal scurrying through the leaves, but the weight of something big pressing into the earth. It came from the trees behind my tent, maybe 40 feet away. I stayed still, my hand moving slowly toward my knife. I held my breath, listening. Another step, closer, then another. I wasn't new to this kind of situation. Could have been a bear, but bears tend to move with more noise. A cougar? Unlikely. They're stealthy but don't just walk up to people. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing, just silence. I eventually convinced myself it was a deer or some other large animal passing through. I forced myself to relax and, after a while, drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my camp. The ground was damp, making it easy to see tracks. I expected to find deer prints or maybe bear tracks. I found neither. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Asterisk, asterisk, boot prints, asterisk, asterisk. Someone had walked up to my camp in the middle of the night and stood there, watching. I wasn't about to pack up and leave over a few footprints, but I wasn't going to ignore them either. Could have been a lost hiker, maybe a hunter who wandered too close. Either way, I kept my revolver on me for the rest of the day. I spent the afternoon hiking farther upstream. I found a few old animal trails and followed them for a while, but didn't see much. A few deer, some squirrels. The forest was thick, the air damp with the smell of moss and wet earth. As the sun started to dip, I turned back. I wasn't about to be out there in the dark. When I got back to camp, something felt off. My firewood pile was scattered. My gear looked like it had been moved. Nothing was missing, but things weren't how I left them. That night, I kept my gun within reach. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing sounds, small noises, like someone moving carefully through the trees. Not an animal crashing through the brush, but something deliberate, careful. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line. A shape, tall, human. But when I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, there was nothing there. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up my gear and started hiking back. About 2 miles from camp, I spotted something odd. ***, a narrow path leading uphill ***, one I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. After about 15 minutes, the path led to a cave entrance. It wasn't deep, maybe 20 feet, with a low ceiling. But what made me stop was what was inside. A sleeping bag. A dirty, torn-up one. Scattered around were empty food cans, a rusted hunting knife, and bones. Small ones, probably from rabbits or squirrels. Someone had been living out here. Someone who had walked up to my camp at night. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. I made it back to my truck by late afternoon. But as I was tossing my pack into the bed, I noticed something. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I looked inside. My gear was still there. My keys were still in the cup holder. But on the seat was something that hadn't been there before. A single muddy handprint. I got in, locked the doors, and drove the hell out of there. I never went back to Devil's Ridge. I don't know who was out there. A drifter? Some lunatic living off the grid? Maybe just a hunter who didn't like me on his land. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, moving through the trees at night, getting close to my tent. And at some point, probably while I was out hiking that last day, they had been inside my truck. I still camp, still love the wilderness, but I don't go out alone anymore. Some places are better left alone. I have always liked the quiet. I grew up in a small town where people knew each other, where life moved slow. I became a cop not for the excitement, but for the steady routine. The job was simple most of the time. Petty crime, drunks, the occasional fight that got out of hand. Nothing big ever happened, and that was fine with me. It was late September 2018 when I decided to take a short camping trip. I had 3 days off and I wanted to get away from everything. Just me, my truck, and the woods. I had been working a lot of night shifts, and the city noise was getting to me. I wanted the silence, the kind that only deep forests could give. I picked a place about 3 hours away from town, a national park with miles of trails and barely any visitors this time of year. The summer crowd was gone, and the cold autumn wind kept most people away. That was perfect for me. I packed light, just the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, my rifle, and my old hunting knife. The rain was supposed to start in the evening, but I didn't mind. I liked the rain. I got there around noon. The road leading into the park was empty, just gravel and mud stretching through the trees. The forest was thick, dark even in the daylight. The leaves were turning red and yellow, but the sky was gray, making everything look dull. I drove down a narrow dirt road until I found a spot far from the main trail. No campsites, no people, just trees and silence. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to the tree-line where the ground was flat. The air smelled like damp earth, like wet leaves and pine. I took my time gathering firewood, stacking it neatly beside the pit I dug out with my boot. The wind was picking up, and I could feel the chill sinking into my jacket. By the time the rain started, I had a small fire going. It crackled quietly as the first drops hit the flames, sizzling for a moment before turning to steam. I sat on a fallen log, eating cold beans from a can, watching the fire flicker. The rain was steady but not heavy, just enough to make the night feel colder. I wasn't worried. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I had my rifle loaded, my knife strapped to my belt. Out here, the only real danger was a bear or maybe a hungry cougar. but even that was rare. They usually stayed away from people. Still, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. The woods were quiet, but not the normal kind of quiet. There were no owls, no crickets, no rustling in the bushes. Just the sound of rain tapping against my tent and the faint hiss of the fire struggling to stay lit. I tried to ignore it. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the rain. The ground was cold, even through the tarp, and the wind made the trees groan. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but close, a soft crunch, footsteps, not an animal, too slow, too deliberate. Someone was walking through the woods. I stayed still, listening. The rain made it hard to tell how far away they were. A few yards? 50? More? I reached for my rifle, my fingers curling around the stock. My breathing was slow, steady, but my heart was beating hard. Who the hell would be out here in this weather? The footsteps stopped. Silence. I held my breath. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the rain. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. A full minute. Nothing. I stayed awake for a long time, gripping my rifle under my sleeping bag, but the sound never came back. Eventually, I drifted off. A loud snap woke me. I sat up fast, heart hammering. The fire was out. The inside of my tent was pitch black. My breath was fogging in the cold air. I listened. Something was outside. A twig breaking. A slow, shuffling sound. I gripped my rifle, my other hand reaching for my knife. My mind was racing. It had to be an animal. Had to be. I waited. The sound moved. Not toward me. Around me. Circling. I swallowed hard, keeping my breath steady. I wasn't new to fear. I had felt it before on the job. But this was different. This wasn't a drunk waving a knife. This wasn't some kid high out of his mind. This was something I couldn't see. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. The rain had stopped. The forest was thick with mist, white fog curling through the trees. My truck was about 50 yards away, parked on the dirt path. Felt farther. I needed to move. I unzipped the tent slowly, making as little noise as possible. I stepped out, rifle up, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. Footprints. Deep, fresh, leading from the tree line to my campsite. Then nothing. No tracks leading away. Whoever had been here had stood in the same spot for God knows how long. Watching. I swallowed hard. The air felt thick, heavy in my chest. I forced myself to breathe slow, quiet. I turned toward my truck, gripping my rifle tight. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not words, just a sound. A breath in the dark. I didn't wait. I moved fast, boots crunching the wet ground, eyes scanning the mist. I kept my rifle ready, every nerve in my body on edge. The truck was close. 10 yards. 5. I reached the door, yanked it open. Something moved in the trees. I didn't look. I jumped in, slammed the door, locked it. The engine roared to life, my headlights cutting through the fog. For a second, I thought I saw something standing just beyond the tree line. A shape, tall, still. Then it was gone. I threw the truck in reverse, tires spinning in the mud, then tore down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing but darkness in my rearview mirror. I never went back, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when it rains, I think about that night, about the footprints that never led away, about the whisper in the dark, and I wonder if it's still out there. I was never much of a camper. Grew up in the suburbs, spent most of my time inside. But after moving to Australia in my late 20s, I figured I should at least try to experience the outdoors. Everyone I met raved about camping, how peaceful it was, how good it felt to be disconnected from everything. So, after months of putting it off, I finally decided to go. I picked a remote spot in the Northern Territory, about 2 hours from any real town. A national park, thick with eucalyptus trees, red dirt roads, and barely any phone signal. It was far enough from civilization that I'd get the full experience, but close enough that I could drive back if things got too rough. I packed light, a one-person tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a knife, a few cans of food, and plenty of water. I wasn't experienced enough to hunt or fish, so I had to rely on what I brought. My plan was simple: drive out in the morning, set up camp by noon, explore a bit, cook dinner, and get some sleep under the stars. It sounded easy enough. The drive was long and empty, just me and the occasional road train roaring past. The deeper I went, the more the land stretched out. Flat, dry, endless. Trees clumped together in patches, some areas so thick you couldn't see through them. Others were just vast plains of nothing but dirt and shrubs. I reached the campsite just before noon. It was exactly how I imagined it. Quiet, isolated, untouched. There was an old fire pit, probably left by another camper, but no signs of anyone around. I set up my tent near a small clearing close to a tree line. Enough shade to stay cool, but not so deep that I'd be completely swallowed by the bush. The first few hours were fine. I walked around, took a few photos, tried to enjoy the quiet. There was something calming about being out there. No cars, no people. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, the occasional bird, and the distant hum of insects. But as the sun started to set, I began to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a weird feeling in my stomach, a little bit of unease, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I tried to ignore it, gathered some wood, and started a fire. I ate my canned food straight out of the tin, watching the flames flicker as the darkness closed in. The sky turned deep blue, then black, stars scattered across it like dust. The fire crackled, sending little embers into the air. The night was still, too still. I expected to hear something, crickets, possums, maybe even a dingo in the distance. But there was nothing, just dead silence. That's when I heard it. A crunch, a slow, deliberate step on dry leaves, somewhere behind my tent. I froze, listening. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a kangaroo, maybe a wallaby. But something about the sound wasn't right. It was too careful, not like an animal hopping or sniffing around. It was slow, heavy, measured. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it towards the trees. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trunks and branches. No movement, no glowing eyes, just empty bush. I swallowed hard and turned back to the fire. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I gripped my knife and stood up. The firelight cast long shadows, flickering against the trees. I scanned the darkness, waiting. My breath felt too loud. My skin prickled. A shape moved between the trees. Not fast, not sudden, just there. First, I thought it was a person. Tall, thin, standing too still. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. Its limbs were too long, its posture too stiff. The head was tilted slightly, like it was listening. A branch snapped under its foot, and then it stepped forward. My stomach dropped. The light caught its face, or what should have been a face. It was wrong. Like someone had tried to copy a human but didn't quite understand how. The skin was stretched too tight, the mouth just a little too wide. The eyes empty, not animal, not human, just black holes in a too pale face. I felt my body go cold. It moved again, slow, deliberate, watching, studying. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my water bottle and threw it as hard as I could. It hit the ground near its feet with a dull thud. For a second, nothing happened. Then it mimicked the sound. A hollow, unnatural thud, like an echo but not quite right. I took a step back, took a step forward. The fire flickered, casting its shifting shape in and out of the shadows. It was close now, too close. I could see the way its skin moved, almost like it wasn't attached properly, like a loose mask over something else. I ran. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just ran. Straight into the bush, away from my tent, away from that thing. Branches scraped my arms, my legs, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. It was following, not running, not chasing, just following, mocking my movements. Every step I took, it took. Every stumble, every heavy breath, it copied me. Perfectly. I don't know how long I ran. Time didn't feel real. It was just me and the sound of my own movements mirrored back at me. But at some point, I saw headlights. A road, a car passing in the distance. I ran harder, burst out of the trees, waving my arms, yelling. The car didn't stop, but it didn't matter. I was close enough to the road now. I sprinted, my lungs burning, until I reached my car. The keys were in my pocket. Shaking hands, fumbling. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. Silence, just my own ragged breathing. I turned on the headlights. The trees lit up. The road, my empty campsite in the distance. Nothing else. No movement, no figure, no sound. I didn't wait. I started the engine and drove. Fast, reckless. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't stop until I reached a motel hours away. Didn't sleep that night. Didn't go back for my tent. I never went camping again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. Because as I lay awake in that motel bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard something outside my window. A soft, deliberate crunch. And then the sound of my own voice, mocking, repeating, a hollow, unnatural laugh. I was 12 when my grandfather took me camping in the backwoods of Montana. It was the summer of 1997, and he wanted to teach me the things his father had taught him. How to fish, track animals, and make a fire from nothing but what we could find around us. He had been a hunter his whole life, and he knew the forests like the back of his hand. My mother wasn't happy about the idea, but my grandfather insisted that every boy should know how to live off the land. We drove for hours, leaving paved roads behind and moving deep into the wild, where even the dirt paths thinned out. The last town we passed was a tiny place called Red Pine. Nothing but a gas station, a diner, and a bait shop. The air smelled fresh, untouched by the fumes of cities, and the trees grew so thick that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. It felt like we had gone back in time to a place where the world hadn't been tamed yet. We set up camp by a lake that had no name on the map. It was a quiet, hidden place, surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. The water was still and dark, reflecting the sky like black glass. My grandfather said we'd have no trouble catching fish here. The first day was perfect. We fished in the morning, and by evening we had caught enough trout for dinner. My grandfather cleaned them while I gathered wood for the fire. That night, we ate under the stars, listening to the sounds of the forest. I remember the way the flames flickered against his face, the deep lines in his skin making him look older than he really was. As I lay in the tent later that night, I listened to the forest around me. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you feel small in the world. I didn't know then that it would be the last peaceful night we'd have. The next morning, we found something strange near our campsite. A deer, or what was left of one. Its body had been torn open, the ribs jutting out like broken fingers. The head was missing. Flies buzzed around it, the smell of rot thick in the air. At first, I thought a bear had done it, but my grandfather crouched beside it, his face dark with something I couldn't name. He pointed at the cuts along the ribs, clean, precise. Not the work of an animal. Poachers, I thought. Maybe someone had killed the deer and taken only what they needed. But why leave it so close to our camp? My grandfather said nothing, but I saw the way his eyes kept drifting to the trees, scanning the shadows between the trunks. That was the first time I felt it. The feeling of being watched. The day passed slowly after that. We went fishing again, but my grandfather was different. Quieter, more alert. His usual patience was gone, and he kept glancing back at the tree line. That night, as we sat by the fire, he barely spoke. When it was time for bed, he told me to keep my knife close, his voice low and serious. He had brought a rifle, too, something he usually only took when hunting. I didn't sleep well. The forest was louder than before. The sounds I had heard the night before, the crickets, the owls, were gone. Instead, there was a different sound. A slow, steady crunching. Footsteps in the undergrowth. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. They were close, too close, but they weren't coming from just one direction. They were circling us. I wanted to wake my grandfather, but before I could move, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent walls, listening to my own breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, my grandfather was already awake when I crawled out of the tent. He was standing by the fire pit, staring at something on the ground. When I walked closer, my stomach dropped. Our cooler was gone. Not just moved, gone. No sign of it anywhere. I looked around the camp, expecting to see it knocked over, maybe dragged off by an animal. But there were no tracks. Nothing. That's when I saw it. My grandfather's hunting knife, the one he always kept strapped to his belt, was lying in the dirt a few feet away. He never left it behind. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. The handle was damp, covered in something dark. Blood. He wiped it off on his pants, his face hard, unreadable. "Pack up," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "We're leaving." I didn't argue. I shoved everything into my bag as fast as I could while my grandfather scanned the woods, his rifle held tight in his hands. We moved fast, following the trail back toward the truck. The forest felt different now, the trees pressing in on us, the silence thick and unnatural. Every few minutes, my grandfather would stop and listen, his grip on the rifle tightening. We weren't alone. The footsteps had returned, following us just out of sight. Sometimes they were close, other times farther away, but they never stopped. Then something new, a sound I will never forget. Breathing, heavy, ragged breathing just beyond the trees. It was deep, slow, deliberate. Not the quick panting of an animal, but something else. Something human. My grandfather raised his rifle, scanning the woods. I could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his jaw clenched. Then he did something that scared me more than anything. He grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Run." We ran. Branches whipped at my face. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Behind us, I heard the footsteps quicken, breaking into a sprint. Whoever, whatever was following us was fast. I heard my grandfather fire a shot. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees. The footsteps faltered, then started again, faster this time. The truck was close. I could see the glint of metal through the trees. My grandfather fired again. This time, the footsteps stopped. We reached the truck, and he shoved me inside, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt road, leaving the trees behind. We didn't stop until we were back in town. My grandfather didn't say a word the whole drive. At the gas station in Red Pine, he pulled over and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but he just shook his head. We never spoke about what happened. A week later, he sold his rifle, stopped hunting, never went back to the woods again. Neither did I, and I never forgot the sound of that breathing in the dark. I was never much of a camper, but when my cousin Brian invited me on a weekend trip deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, I figured it would be a good way to clear my head. I was 28 at the time, stuck in a boring routine, working long hours at a job I didn't care about, and barely seeing the outside of my apartment. A weekend in the woods sounded like a break I needed. We planned for a 3-day trip in mid-October. The weather was getting colder, but not unbearable, and the summer crowds were gone. Brian had been camping all his life, and he swore up and down that he knew of a perfect, secluded spot miles away from any trails. We packed our gear, tent, sleeping bags, food, water, and some basic hunting supplies. Brian always carried a rifle when camping just in case. He wasn't paranoid, but he liked to be prepared. The drive took us 5 hours from Boise, winding through narrow mountain roads until we reached a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. We parked at a small clearing where the trees were thin enough to squeeze the vehicle through. From there, we hiked another 2 hours, pushing deeper into the woods until Brian found the spot he was looking for. It was a small clearing on a slight incline, with thick trees surrounding it on all sides. There was no sign that anyone had camped there before. No fire pit, no footprints, no trash. Just untouched forest. The air smelled clean, the kind of crisp mountain air you don't get in the city. We set up our tent near a fallen tree, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped below the trees. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. That changed on the second night. The first night had been uneventful. We ate, drank, and listened to the sounds of the forest. I slept well, better than I expected, but on the second night, something felt off. I woke up in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., with a strange feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, just unease. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, and everything was silent. Too silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know that nature is never completely quiet. There's always something: crickets, wind, the rustling of small animals. But this? Nothing. No sound at all. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening, but the silence felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. Then, from somewhere in the trees, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer sound like when they move. I know what a bear sounds like crashing through the underbrush. This was different. It sounded like careful footsteps, like someone trying not to be heard but stepping on just enough leaves and twigs to give themselves away. I turned toward Brian's sleeping bag, but I could barely make him out in the darkness. He wasn't moving. I couldn't even hear him breathing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't circling us. It was coming straight from one direction, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the trees. Then it stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a lost hunter, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting. I never heard the footsteps again. By the time the first hint of light crept through the trees, I was exhausted. I must have drifted off at some point because Brian was already up, poking at the fire, looking normal like nothing had happened. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. Maybe I should have. We spent the day hiking, scouting the area, looking for any signs of wildlife. But the strangest thing was that there was nothing. No animal tracks.
No droppings. No birds. No squirrels.
The whole forest felt empty. We hunted for a few hours, but we saw nothing.
No deer. No rabbits.
Not even a single bird in the sky. Brian joked that we had the worst luck ever, but I could see the confusion in his face. He'd hunted all over these mountains before, and he'd never seen it this dead. That night, I made sure the fire was bigger. I didn't want to be caught in the dark again. It didn't help. I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside the tent. Deep, slow, right outside the thin layer of fabric. I didn't move. The fire was still burning, casting a dim orange glow through the tent walls, but I couldn't see anything. Just the sound of breathing, then a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever, whatever, was out there would hear it. I wanted to wake Brian up, but I was frozen. Couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The breathing got louder. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't hear anything else. Finally, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and I forced myself to move. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the fire. It was dead, completely, not burned out naturally, smothered like someone had poured dirt over it. Then I saw the tracks, long, deep drag marks in the dirt, starting from the edge of the clearing and leading back into the woods. I woke Brian up. We packed up and left without saying a word. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to, and I haven't been camping since. I don't camp much anymore. Not after that trip in the summer of 2013. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend trip to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I needed a break from the noise of the city. I was 31 back then, single and stuck in a cycle of working, sleeping, and wasting weekends on the couch. My boss kept piling on more responsibilities, and my head felt like it was constantly buzzing. So I figured a couple of nights alone in the woods would do me some good. I picked a spot in the Green River National Forest in Kentucky, far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't have to deal with people, but still close enough that I could get back to my truck within an hour or two if something went wrong. I camped alone before, so I wasn't worried. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had my phone too, but service was spotty out there, which was fine. I didn't want to be bothered. I parked my truck at a gravel pull-off near an old trailhead. There was no one else around. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. The air was thick and humid, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through the trees in a winding path. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Birds chirped overhead. Bugs buzzed in the air. It was peaceful. I walked for about 3 hours before I found a good spot. A small clearing, flat and dry, with a stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going as the sun started dipping below the trees. By nightfall, the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I sat by the fire, eating a packet of dried beef and watching the flames flicker. Normally, you hear crickets, frogs, maybe an owl in the distance. But that night, there was nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Put me on edge, but I told myself it was fine. Animals get quiet when there's a predator around, but that just meant a fox or a bobcat was nearby. Nothing I couldn't handle. I stayed up for a while, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind. My tent rustled slightly, and I could hear the trees swaying. But then I heard something else. A faint, steady crunching sound. Footsteps, not heavy, just light enough that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I stayed still, my breath slow and quiet. My knife was next to me, within reach. I told myself not to panic. If it was a person, they had no reason to be out here. No reason to come into my camp. If it was an animal, it would move on. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, careful. Then they stopped. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. My heart pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, just outside my tent. Breathing, slow, deep, right on the other side of the fabric. I gripped my knife tight and held my breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, crunching lightly over the forest floor, fading into the distance. I waited. 10 minutes, 20, an hour, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came and the forest was normal again. Birds were chirping, bugs were buzzing, sunlight streamed through the trees. It almost felt like I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. My fire was just smoldering coals now. Everything looked the same except footprints. They circled my tent in a slow, careful loop. Human footprints, bare feet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone out here. I packed my things fast. Didn't eat, didn't drink. Just stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back to my truck. I moved fast, faster than I should have with a full pack. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but I didn't. The woods were normal again. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat, breathing hard. I tossed my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before I even turned the key. As I pulled out onto the gravel road, I looked back once, just to be sure. There was nothing there, just trees. But I didn't go back to the woods after that. Not alone, not ever, because somewhere out there, deep in those trees, someone was watching, and they were barefoot. I was never the type of person to believe in bad omens or signs from the universe. But after what happened in the summer of 2018, I started thinking differently. I had been on a solo camping trip in the remote parts of New Mexico, somewhere between the Lincoln National Forest and the flat, desolate stretches of desert. I had done solo trips before, mostly in the mountains of Colorado, but I wanted something different this time. Something quiet where I wouldn't run into anyone for days. I drove out from my home in Arizona, packing enough supplies to last me at least a week. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for desert nights, a cooler filled with food, a portable stove, extra water, and of course, my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I always carried a knife just in case. I found a good spot just before sunset, a flat, open stretch of desert land about 2 miles off a dirt road. No signs of human activity, no tire tracks, no trash. Just the desert and me. I set up camp, built a small fire, and watched as the last bit of sun dipped behind the horizon. The silence was incredible. Just the occasional sound of wind brushing through dry shrubs and the distant howl of a coyote. It wasn't until my third night that things started to feel off. That night, the wind had completely stopped. Not even the usual rustling of brush or the distant hum of insects. just pure, dead silence. I had a small fire going, sitting beside it and eating a can of chili when I heard something in the distance. A soft crunch, like a boot stepping on dry dirt. I froze. My mind immediately went to an animal, maybe a coyote or a deer, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark landscape beyond the reach of my fire. Nothing, just an endless stretch of desert, empty and motionless. I listened for another minute, holding my breath. Then, another sound. This time it was closer, the unmistakable sound of a footstep. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dirt and shrubs. I kept it there for a few seconds, then swept the light to the left, then the right. Still nothing. My gut told me something was out there, watching, waiting. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been alone in the desert for days. Solitude can mess with your head. I finished my dinner, threw a few more pieces of wood on the fire, and crawled into my tent. I kept my knife close, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made my muscles tense up. A few times, I thought I heard something outside my tent, but I convinced myself it was just the wind picking back up. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool desert air. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and took a deep breath. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I crouched down, inspecting them closely. The prints were deep, fresh, and large. Definitely a man's. Someone had been here, watching me while I slept. My stomach twisted. My brain went into overdrive, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe some rancher checking on his land? No, I had been 2 miles off the nearest dirt road. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I stood up and scanned the horizon, my heart pounding in my chest. The desert was empty, no movement, no sign of whoever had made those tracks. I told myself that maybe they had just been passing through. Maybe they had been just as surprised to see my tent as I was to see their tracks. I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to the back of my mind like a weight. I decided to stay for one more night. I had come out here to get away, and I wasn't going to let some random footprints scare me off. I should have left right then and there. That night, I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the darkness, knife in my hand, listening. First, it was quiet, just the occasional breeze. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I stayed absolutely still, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then breathing, right outside my tent. Low, steady breathing. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Then, a soft scratch against the fabric of my tent. I snapped. I lunged forward, stabbing my knife through the tent wall with all my strength. I heard a sharp gasp, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. I scrambled out of the tent, knife in hand, scanning my surroundings. Nothing, just the desert silent as ever. But there was something on my knife. Blood. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the ground. A trail of fresh blood droplets led away from my tent, disappearing into the night. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into my truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about packing properly. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As I drove away, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of my campsite, watching me leave. I never went back. I never reported it. What would I even say? That some man had been stalking me in the middle of nowhere? That I stabbed someone but had no proof of who they were or why they were there? But I still think about it. about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't had my knife. Whoever he was, he had been waiting, watching, and he wasn't just passing through.